Good evening and welcome to Malard at Large. Tonight, my guest is John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump at the White House. In other words, he was the former number 2 of the Trump administration. Right now, his TV profile by Ellen Corby.
John Bolton was born to a modest family in the suburbs of Baltimore on the East Coast of the United States. In the 1970s, he studied law at Yale University and became a lawyer. During his studies, he became involved in politics and was active in the Young Conservatives. During this period, John Bolton distinguished himself by writing an anti-communist editorial and as a supporter of the war in Vietnam. He soon joined the American administration under Ronald Reagan. After working in international development, he spent 4 years at the Department of Justice. Then, in 1989, under George Bush, he joined the State Department and was in charge of the relations with international organizations. In particular, he opposed American peacekeeping missions around the world, and particularly the humanitarian intervention in Somalia. A few years later, George W. Bush brought him into his inner circle. John Bolton became responsible for disarmament issues. His key missions were on South Korea and Iran. He was also a supporter of the war in Iraq and the concept of preventative war. In 2018, President Donald Trump appointed him National Security Advisor, a position from which he will resign a year later, following controversial statements against the International Criminal Court. This experience with the American president was the basis of a book he published in 2020. The book is a real accusation of incompetence against Donald Trump, who even tried to prevent its publication. Bolton also published a pamphlet against Barack Obama, whom he accused of endangering the national sovereignty of the United States. In August 2022, the American judicial system revealed that a plot to assassinate John Bolton had been defeated. The plot was led by an Iranian, a member of the Revolutionary Guards. Definitely right-wing and also a nationalist, John Bolton is an advocate exclusively of American rights and does not believe in the concept of an international community.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton, for having accepted our invitation of tonight. Right now, let's not waste time and go straight into our questions. Mr. Bolton, when you look at the overall situation of the world, don't you think we have in front of us all the ingredients of a third world war?
Well, I think the situation worldwide is very threatening, and I think both in the United States and Europe and other places around the world, we're late in waking up to how dangerous the situation may be. But I think we've seen just in the past few weeks with the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow to see Vladimir Putin, that the axis between Moscow and Beijing has already formed. And they have with them rogue states like Iran and North Korea and Belarus. So this growing challenge really around the world is now global. It's in Asia along the Chinese periphery. It's in the Middle East. It's in Europe, where Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine. And I think that these threats all around the world should certainly be on the minds of everybody in the West.
It's clear the world order issued from 1945 under U.S. dominance is obsolete. Don't you fear that Xi Jinping's China wants to impose its hegemony with Russia, which is just his ally of circumstance?
Yes, I think China has made it very clear. It has territorial and political aspirations along its periphery. It has economic aspirations worldwide, and I think ultimately hegemony on a global basis. And it's been pursuing this course for many years. You know, people say China's changed in the past few years. I don't think so at all. I think if you remember what Deng Xiaoping said in the 1980s when he moved China toward market principles away from Marxism, he said the Chinese policy was what he called hide and bide. Hide your capabilities and bide your time, meaning don't reveal to the West what your capabilities are. Don't press at the moment because China's not strong enough. Now the leadership in China thinks it is strong enough, and it's not hiding its capabilities, it's not biding its time. that doesn't reflect a change in China's strategy. It reflects a change in how willing they are to be public about it. And I hope, therefore, results in a change in our understanding of what Chinese aspirations really are.
Can we say, Mr. Bolton, the world is entering a confrontation era with, on the one hand, a Chinese, Russian, Iranian, North Korean axis versus the Western axis, USA, European Union, and Israel?
Well, I think that it may be we're entering into a period of confrontation, but not because of anything that the West has done, but because of the behavior of countries like China and Russia. They're the ones who are acting belligerently. It's hard to imagine a more naked case of aggression than the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. I think China's preparation, its aspiration to go after Taiwan is evident. They've made a military base out of much of the South China Sea. They threaten disputed territory in the East China Sea. So if there's a confrontation coming, it will be because of the belligerent, aggressive behavior of Beijing and Moscow. If they were content merely to engage in trade and economic competition, that would be one thing. But they consistently go way beyond that. And I think now it's a question whether the West wakes up to this challenge and is able to defend itself.
Do you see an issue to the war in Ukraine as long as Putin, Zelensky, Biden will stick to their intransigent position of unconditional refusal to negotiate?
Well, I don't see any incentive for either Zelensky, certainly, or Putin to try and seek a diplomatic recognition. The positions of the two countries are completely inconsistent. Putin insists that Ukraine is an illegitimate state, that the destruction, in fact, of the Soviet Union was a Western plot, and he doesn't recognize that Ukraine has really a right to be independent. Zelensky, on the other hand, not only insists on Ukrainian independence, he insists on what was agreed to by the presidents of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia in 1991, when Boris Yeltsin, the only really freely elected president in Russia's history, agreed that the three of them and the rest of the Russian Federation would break up along the lines of the internal republics. And Zelensky at this point has no desire, and I think would be in political trouble himself domestically if he gave up the effort to regain sovereignty and territorial control over all of Ukraine as defined by that breakup agreement in 1991.
Iran is on the verge of getting the nuclear bomb. Will Israel have to intervene militarily on its own to delay or even derail its nuclear program, knowing it cannot rely upon the Biden administration?
Right. Well, I think it's been clear for 20 years, if not more, that Iran has never given up the strategic intention of getting deliverable nuclear weapons, not through all of the negotiations that led to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, not since then. So really the problem here is that Iran has tried to deceive the rest of the world, continued to pursue nuclear weapons, and yet also get economic benefits out of the 2015 deal. When the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the deal, that obviously disrupted Iran's calculus. But notwithstanding the Biden administration's effort to go back into the 2015 deal, Iran continues to pursue nuclear weapons in military facilities in Iran that the International Atomic Energy Agency has never seen, has no visibility into. So we think that there's every reason to believe that given Iran's continued desire to get nuclear weapons, it makes progress whether the U.S. is in the deal or not in the deal.
We have a break now. We will be back in a few minutes. We are back with our guest, John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, So, John Bolton.
So that really leaves Israel in a very difficult position. The Israelis believe correctly, in my view, that an Iranian nuclear weapons capability was a legitimate, was an existential threat to Israel, and that Israel would have a legitimate right of preemptive self-defense. So if the U.S. doesn't show willingness to take the necessary action, then I don't think anybody should be surprised if Israel makes its own decision to go after Iran's nuclear program, as Israel did against the Iraqi program in 1981, and already against the Iranian program by destroying the reactor being built in Syria in 2007. I mean, Israel has time and again demonstrated it will act in its own self-defense against the nuclear threat. And I think the Iranians need to remember that.
Mr. Bolton, what game are the Saudis playing with the normalization of their relations with Iran? Will the other Gulf countries follow blindly?
Well, it's not entirely clear to me what the Saudis have in mind, but I think part of it is a rejection of the Biden administration political posture towards Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Arab countries. There's plenty of reason to understand why the Saudis and others really don't pay much attention to what Biden is doing. Now, this supposed settlement with Iran, the exchange of diplomatic relations, returning to normalcy, depends critically on whether Iran stops aiding the Houthi rebels in Yemen with cruise missiles and drones and other weapons that have been used against civilian targets in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Many people believe Iran will comply and that full diplomatic relations will resume. I guess I'll just say, let's wait and see. It wouldn't be the first time that Iran has committed to give up supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen and yet failed to do so. So it's not, I think, positive development for Iran and the Saudis to get back together. But I'm not yet sure it's actually going to happen in the end.
Can Saudi Arabia be gullible to the point of believing that Iran can participate to the stabilization of Middle East with its nuclear and ballistic program?
Well, I don't believe the Saudis think that that's possible. And I think that it could be that the deal in Yemen is simply a way to resolve a conflict there that has consumed Saudi time and attention and resources, and yet not led to a clear result in favor of the side that the Saudis back. So that this is simply a pragmatic accommodation to the military reality in Yemen. But it's hard to believe that that will simply result in closer Saudi-Iranian relations. It seems to me it would be a big mistake for the Saudis to believe that there's any reason to think Iran is less of a threat to Saudi Arabia after resolving Yemen than before. But I think the Saudis, as I said, were so put off by the Biden administration's approach that the Saudis were prepared to talk to China, for one thing, to keep open oil and gas sales to China, not to cede that market to Iran. It's very unsatisfactory, I think, from the American perspective. And I think a frank discussion with Saudi Arabia about who their real friends are would be in order. But I understand why the Biden administration is not necessarily the American government that the Saudis are going to pay any attention to. It would be hard to believe anybody could really think the Saudis were gullible. But it's they look at the American political process and wonder when we're going to get consistency in our approach to the Middle East, and I don't think we'll have it before our next election.
Would you say, Mr. Bolton, that the Iranian regime could have been overthrown recently by the majority of its population had not it benefited from the support of China and Russia?
Yeah, no, look, I think that that the opposition movement inside Iran has really crossed new frontiers over the past 6 or 7 months since the killing of Mahsa Amini. I think that opposition to the regime really extends across the entire country. I think it's much more serious than the opposition that was engendered by the economic difficulties really going back 4 or 5 years now, but pretty brutally repressed by the regime in 2019. Those economic difficulties have not gone away, and neither has popular dissatisfaction. And the rejection of the idea that the Ayatollahs can speak the word of God to the population and they must accept it is what the opposition has now rejected by protesting against the application of this principle of the mullahs running the country with respect to women's dress. It's not simply about a dress code. I mean, it's not about schoolboys and schoolgirls wearing uniforms in school. This is a fundamental opposition to the ideological legitimacy of the Iranian regime, that the Ayatollahs speak the word of God. And if you look at reports of these demonstrations all around the country, the demonstrators are not saying death to Israel or death to the United States. They're saying death to the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader.
Do you fear the encirclement of Israel by Iran and its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, from Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria?
Well, I think the Israelis have made it clear that that they're prepared to do what they need to do in their own self-defense, whether it's going after the Iranian nuclear program, if it's not dismantled or otherwise disposed of, and in their Israel's very strong defense against threats from Hezbollah, Hamas, or other terrorist groups that the Iranians are aiding, whether it's in Israel itself or in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank or Syria or Iran itself. So I believe that the Israelis are fully aware of the potential threat they face, given all the rockets and drones that Hezbollah, for example, has in Lebanon, and the prospect that if Iran had nuclear weapons that Hezbollah could deliver, that Israel would be subject to a nuclear holocaust. So I don't think the Israelis will allow that to happen. It may make things even more difficult in the region, but from the Israeli point of view, if it's the very survival of the country and the aspiration of the Jewish people, I don't think there's any doubt they will do whatever they need in self-defense.
On May the 14th, Turkey will hold presidential and legislative elections. How do you view its future with or without unpredictable Erdogan, who has 1 foot in NATO and 1 foot in Putin's backyard?
Well, I think these May 14 elections are about the most significant elections Turkey has ever had. And I think the mood of the country, for a lot of reasons, is such that if the elections are free and fair, Erdogan will be defeated. What I worry about is that whether in the initial election or in the runoff, if no candidate gets 50% or more, Erdogan will use corrupt means to try and steal the election. I'm worried very much about that. But all of the signs point to him being in real political trouble. The Kurds have endorsed the opposition candidate. The opposition's not completely united, probably never is in circumstances like this, but the chance for an outright win in the first round, I think, are real. I think, again, if the election is not stolen and voters turn out, that Erdogan will be defeated. I think this is very important for Turkey. I don't think Erdogan represents the will of the people. I think we saw that back in 2019 in the key elections in Istanbul and Ankara, Izmir, other major Turkish cities, where despite efforts by Erdogan to stuff the ballot boxes, go to court to stop the opposition from winning, nonetheless, their voices prevailed. So I'm optimistic that if the people of Turkey really can give get a fair chance to have their votes count, that Erdogan will be defeated. I think that will be a huge plus for NATO and all of its members and for peace and stability in the Middle East.
Mr. Bolton, do you trust Xi Jinping to respect the sovereignty of the states of the former Soviet Union and not to attack Taiwan?
I think the Chinese will do whatever they think they can get away with respect to Taiwan. I think that's why the people of Taiwan, which I've just returned from visiting for almost a week, I think that's why they're so concerned about the threat of either outright Chinese aggression against them in the form of an invasion or more indirect form of aggression by using some pretext to create a political crisis and then putting a blockade around the island. The Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party respect only one thing, and that's power. And I think it's now our obligation for the United States, and I hope Europe will see this the same way, to help Taiwan create structures of deterrence that will back Xi Jinping and the Communist Party off. They don't see Taiwan as a legitimate independent country. And although the Chinese tried to walk back what their ambassador to France said some weeks ago, I don't think they see the independent states of the former Soviet Union as legitimately independent either. This is what Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have in common. They see that sort of thing exactly the same way. I think that's one of their fundamental precepts in their alliance. And I think as long as they are allowed to assert that unchallenged, that's one of the reasons why we face the global threats we do.
How do you view Biden's running for re-election?
Well, I know he has declared his candidacy. I still think ultimately he will not run for another full term. I think his age and his performance really have many in the Democratic Party, especially in Congress, very worried that if he is the Democratic nominee, that they will lose the presidency and will lose control of the Senate and lose control of the House by an even bigger margin.
Any prediction on the future Republican candidacy for U.S. presidential election of November 2024? What would be the ideal candidate?
But I don't think Trump will get the Republican nomination. I think there are a whole range of candidates. Some are in the race, some might not get in the race. Others will. I'm considering myself what to do. But I think there are a lot of reasons to be confident that a qualified Republican candidate, someone other than Donald Trump, would have an excellent chance of beating Biden or whomever the Democrats nominate on their side for the election next year. I think people see the performance of the economy under the Democrats has not been good. There's not a stable basis for growth. I think they see the concern around the world for challenges to the United States and its allies, and the importance of having a strong American presence in the world to protect our interest and to protect our economy and way of life here at home. So there's a long way to go to November of 2024, and I do think national security will be a bigger issue in the 24 campaign than in many other recent elections. So I'm optimistic about Republican chances next year.
Thank you, Mr. John Bolton, for having accepted our invitation. Good evening on I24 News, and see you soon in Malard at Large.